you are more likely to have a C-section or an episiotomy based upon your doctors and hospitals' rates of those procedures, not anything to do with your body or your risk or your baby or theirs.
And welcome back. You're listening to Hysteria, the podcast where we like history lessons that make us smarter and madder. Today's guest is a journalist, producer, and speaker. Her new book, Birth Control, The Insidious Power of Men Over Motherhood, is out and available wherever you get books. Allison Yarrow, welcome to Hysteria.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, book was fascinating, book was infuriating. What prompted you to write it?
What prompted me to write the book was going through the experience of having a child in this country 3 times, twice in a hospital environment and once planned at home. And what I realized in sort of preparing for my first birth was that even though I have been a journalist for almost 2 decades in newsrooms and I covered abortion law and policy, and I'm very awake and aware to the ways in which our systems are shaped by patriarchy and by white supremacy, I just didn't really believe that that was going to touch my pregnancy and my birth. And that was a completely naive thing to think. But taking, a childbirth preparation class with my husband, I started to realize that all of the framing was around what we could do to protect ourselves against the providers we had chosen to attend our birth and the place where we had chosen to deliver our baby, which was the hospital, which is where about 99% of people give birth to their children. And just going to the experience of thinking that I had bodily autonomy, knowing what I wanted to have happen in my birth experience, and then sort of being cajoled and sort of swayed to do things that weren't exactly what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. I just had a baby. She just turned 2 this week. So I didn't just have a baby, but time flies. And I remember feeling the same way. Like, why do I have to? Oh, so they don't need to do cervical checks on me? They're totally unnecessary, and they don't really tell anybody anything, and they're for the convenience of the provider entirely? Like, what? And having to put together a birth plan that was like, please don't do this thing that you're going to try to do, and I'm going to have to argue with you against doing it. It's like wild. It is wild. And you're totally right about how many things that you're like, oh, this is for the convenience of the hospital. This is so that the provider doesn't get sued in case something goes wrong. This is for somebody else's convenience. This is for my insurance company. And very little of it felt like it was for the birthing person.
Yes, everything that you're saying and more. The system that we are birthing in is broken. And the reason that it's broken, I surveyed about 1,300 people about their birth experiences, in addition to doing deep reporting with experts and looking into the data on this stuff. And what I found time and time again, and it took me a while to piece it all together, was that we are giving birth in a system that is operating based in tradition, not in the best scientific evidence. So when you walk in the door of the hospital, you go to triage, you're in labor. Everything that starts to happen to you from that cervical check that you mentioned, Erin, from the, that's what you need to get entry into the hospital. They need to check your cervix and see how dilated you are, even though there's no standard agreed upon amount of dilation that says, okay, now a baby is going to come in this amount of time. So from that to you are admitted, you're hooked up to an electronic fetal monitor, which is technology that's in almost every childbirth, but is based in zero evidence. It was sort of it got into hospitals from marketers, from people who sort of didn't have the science to back it up. They sort of said, let's test this on women and see how it works. It's been a really addictive technology for hospitals and for providers to get rid of because they can watch multiple labors from a remote location. So that's not based in evidence. Then they're going to try to put you on Pitocin. Maybe you want Pitocin and that's fine. But if you don't, and if it's to start a labor or to speed up contractions that haven't really started going yet, and you don't realize, it can be a really challenging experience. So that's not based in evidence either. And then say, you are taking too long or the doctor is ready to go home and have dinner. Perhaps they're going to suggest surgery, whether or not you need it. And that's also not based in evidence. So basically everything, they call this the cascade of interventions. All of this stuff that we think of as put in place to protect us and to keep us safe, to keep our babies safe, is actually not rooted in any good evidence.
So, Allison, as someone who has never birthed, I found the history of the industry and culture around birth that you address in Birth Control fascinating. Can you describe how birth once looked versus how it looks now?
Absolutely. So in this country, sort of when it was founded, birth was a tradition and a sacrament that was for women. That was sort of, women were experiencing it, women were attending it, women of all ages, girls would sort of be part of the experience of birth. And it was really this beautiful spiritual tradition. And what happened was sort of as, white men traveled to Europe to get medical degrees before there were medical schools in this country, they came back to the US to set up their practices. And what was needed here in America in terms of healthcare was birth care. And so midwives were very happy to share their techniques and share what they knew. Midwives attended births at this time sort of universally, and they didn't learn in medical school how to attend a birth. They just attended thousands and thousands of births. That's how they learned, apprenticeship. And so when the doctors came along and said, we want to help, they taught them how to attend birth. And eventually, they sort of worked side by side, but eventually doctors, sort of studied in the obstetrics methods and wanted to use tools and arts and drugs. And we know how to make this safer, and we know how to do this better. And so it evolved so that male doctors stole birth from midwives, eventually putting it in a hospital environment at the turn of the century, promising women that this would be a safer experience and a better experience. But because of puerperal fever, which, we didn't understand sort of the history of bacteria and that hand washing was life-saving, puerperal fever killed so many people in the hospital environment, whereas people who were still birthing at home with midwives were safe and spared. So this history of sort of doctors, male doctors, people who never have and never will give birth, coming in and beginning to control this process in the body, converting it into a procedure in the hospital, really is still so evident in the way that we birth today.
It reminded me a little bit of how spirituality and religion was stolen from women, and we were called witches and bad stuff happened to us. It reminded me very much of that sort of a theft in pursuit of profit. Can we talk a little bit more about some of the upsetting history of obstetrics? I think a lot of people don't quite know how bad it is.
Yeah. So, obstetrics, the thing about obstetrics that's important to know today, and this is tied to the history question, is that when people go to medical school to study obstetrics, the first thing that they learn is how to perform a C-section. They learn how to deal with the most high-risk pregnancy, and they have very little access to what actual physiologic birth looks like. So that's why, even if you, like Erin, you said you wrote out your birth plan, even if you write out a birth plan and you say, I'd really prefer to avoid cesarean section, episiotomy, these surgical procedures in my birth. Even if you say those things, doctors don't exactly know what physiologic birth looks like. They haven't had those experiences. So that is why you are more likely to have a C-section or an episiotomy based upon your doctors and hospitals' rates of those procedures, not anything to do with your body or your risk or your baby or theirs. It's really about sort of what they do and what they know how to do. Speaking to this, there's a really interesting study about perineal tearing. So sometimes during labor, people experience tearing, and there really are ways to prevent this. But the positions that, obstetricians want you to be in while you're giving birth, sort of, supine on your back, actually it closes the pelvic outlet, making it more difficult for you to give birth, but it's easier for them to see. So that's why they like it. They like it because they can just see better. But there was a study that showed that sort of a hot compress, if you use a hot compress on the perineum, that would, sort of stretch somebody and make it less likely that they would tear. But they actually don't totally know whether it's the compress that prevents the tearing, or if it's just that doctors' hands are kept busy applying that compress so that they won't cut you. They don't really know what the difference is.
Mm-hmm. I was really, saddened by all of the anecdotes and stories and research that you had on how traumatic birth was for so many women. Because, of course, for a lot of my friends, it was the same deal. They had some sort of unexpected complication that was handled in a way that they wouldn't have preferred. And, on the other hand, I love my OBGYN. Her C-section rate is super low. It's one of the things that she talks about. She's super if you want to give birth in a birth center, she's go for it. I got a midwife I can recommend. She has a list of doulas. And, she attended my child's birth and she was amazing. And it makes me feel there are good birth professionals out there. And it's so frustrating to see that bad ones continue on, given the fact that there are several examples of how to be good at it.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad to hear that you had that experience of someone that you trusted really taking care of you. It's interesting. It's really less, I think, about sort of individual bad providers than it is about a system that makes it nearly impossible for people who go into this profession because they are heroes. They want to take care of people while they bring life into the world. And that is so commendable. And yet they're really thwarted in this system. They're kind of forced into making decisions based around sort of avoiding litigation or profit incentives. I mean, that would be a huge change in this space, would be to disincentivize all of the intervention, sort of decouple it from profit. C-section is sort of one of the most common surgeries in the country. Maternity care is some of the most expensive care that's taking place in a hospital setting. And this just sets everyone up for failure. I found, in some research by Cheryl Beck, who's a nurse and also has spent decades looking at birth trauma numbers, she found that about 45% of people describe their birth experience as traumatic. And that's so high. That's so incredibly high. And what she also has found, and what sort of appeared also in my study, is that people often believe when things didn't go the way that they had planned, that it was their fault. They internalize this sense of self-blame when the blame is actually at the foot of this system that needs to change.
Allison, why do you think men saw and continue to see women more as opportunities to profit than as human beings with agency?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, I think that 4 million people give birth in the country each year. It is the main reason that people go into a hospital environment. And it's just so shocking to me that you can't sort of expect this experience or anticipate this experience to be one in which you are centered in your own care. I mean, we've seen the research that shows us the vast amount of disbelief that men have in women's stories of pain. And this is particularly true for Black women. Their pain is not believed in hospital settings, in birth settings. And then when we speak up about our pain or about what we're experiencing, we're often penalized. The research shows us that too. You have to be a good patient. And I think some of this, dates back to some of these sort of old obstetric ideas that women's bodies are not really able to birth. There's an idea called the obstetric dilemma, which is, sort of been absorbed into taking care of pregnant people. It's an idea from anthropology. And it really says that the birthing body is inherently flawed. The female body is inherently flawed. The pelvis is this certain size and it, expands, of course, to allow a baby to be born, but that the babies are born sort of helpless. And so this is flawed design. That's what this anthropological theory says. But this theory has been absorbed as reality. And we see it show up when there's a prediction that a big baby means we have to operate. When we know from the research that you can't tell the size of a baby sort of in the later weeks of pregnancy. The best measurement we have of that is looking at an ultrasound scan from weeks about 11 to 14. That's when we have the best sense of the size of the baby. After that, we don't really know, but there's a lot of intervention. Men are intervening, male doctors, and those that they train. The profession of obstetrics is, becoming a very female profession, but they're still being trained in this patriarchal way of sort of going in and saying, you know what, we're going to take the baby now because we think the baby is too big. Not we're going to listen to you. We're going to listen to what you believe, to your body. It's all sort of, I think some of it is fear. It's fear of the birthing body and this procreative, generative, incredible, miraculous process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being a woman is terrifying, in part because of that. Because having a child is the weirdest and scariest and most out of control, even like without the medicalization aspect of it. Just like your body just being like, whoop, doing this. Don't care what you think, just gonna do it. Pretty wild. So, Allison, you've done so much research into this, into this area, into the experience of motherhood and birth. If you were to meet somebody who had just found out they were pregnant for the first time, what information would you want to convey to them about how to avoid or how to head off some of the things that turn out to be traumatic for first-time moms?
Thank you for asking that. I would recommend the book because I think that you can read in there what you need to know to keep yourself safe. But this actually happens to me quite commonly. Like you, I have a lot of friends who are sort of in this experience right now or sort of have been recently. And I really approach every conversation with listening to what this person in front of me seems like she needs, because everyone is really different and approaching this differently. And I think if we had a culture and a society that really shared birth stories and celebrated birth stories and incorporated them into our wider cultural narratives, then this just would be part of this conversation that we were often and always having and celebrating. Birth is something beautiful and miraculous to celebrate. It doesn't have to be this sort of taboo, sort of painful, traumatic experience that it is for so many people. And it's not their fault that it is that experience. It's that our society sort of silences these stories. And so we don't know what's possible. We're not told what's possible. But if the stories were more frequent, we could all sort of share in this knowledge that this is a beautiful experience. This is an experience that we never forget. It's practically touching the sublime, one of the rare times in your life that you do that. And that's sort of what I want people who are pregnant to walk away with, understanding like you are inherently so very powerful. All of the forces in the world, from, sort of the medical industrial complex to the major societal narratives, are telling you that that's not true. They're telling you your body is flawed. And so that disconnects us from what we know to be our own power. And I want everyone to know that like that power is there and it's accessible. And it's important to find providers who you align with, like you did, Erin, people who you trust, who you can say, this is how I want my birth to go. How are you going to support me in that?
Allison, thank you so much for writing the book. And thank you so much for joining us. Allison Yarrow's book, Birth Control, The Insidious Power of Men Over Motherhood, is available wherever you can get books.
Thank you for having me.